On today's episode, we sit down with Ryan Dusick, the founding drummer of Maroon 5. In this raw and unfiltered interview, Ryan shares his journey from a self-taught musician to the glamorous heights of Maroon 5's success and the immense personal and mental challenges that came with it. We dive into his memoir, Harder to Breathe, where he reveals the physical and mental struggles, imposter syndrome, and anxiety that shaped his early career. Plus, Ryan opens up about his transition into clinical psychology, his battle with addiction, and his new passion for mental health advocacy. You won't want to miss this incredible story of rediscovering purpose and embracing excellence over perfection. Insiders, are you ready?
Welcome to MUBUTV's Music Business Insider Podcast, where our mission is to educate, empower, and engage artists and music business professionals who are dedicated to having a successful career in the new music industry. Here are your hosts, Rich Ezra and Eric Knight. Welcome back, Insiders, to another episode of the MUBUTV Music Business Insider Podcast, where our mission is to educate, empower, and engage your music career. On today's episode, we welcome Ryan Dusick, the original drummer for the iconic band Maroon 5, and now a devoted therapist and author. Ryan takes us on a raw and unfiltered journey through his experiences from forming the band at the age of 16 to dealing with the immense pressures of stardom. We discuss the anxiety and imposter syndrome that plagued him during his early success, his physical and mental struggles, and how writing his memoir, Harder to Breathe, was both a therapeutic and passionate undertaking. Ryan also talks about his transition into a career in clinical psychology, his passion for advocacy, and how mind-blowing it was to perform on major platforms like Saturday Night Live. He shares his insights on the need for mental health support in the music industry, the role of mindfulness, and the dangers of perfectionism, with stories of touring life, coping with pressure, and the importance of genuine connection in the age of social media. This interview promises to be an inspiring and enlightening ride. You don't want to miss it. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Hey, Insiders! Are you an aspiring musician, artist, band, or future music business professional looking to take your career to the next level? Well, look no further. At MUBUTV, we offer personalized career counseling and coaching designed specifically for folks like you.
Imagine having both of us by your side, guiding you through every step of your music journey. Our sessions are tailored to meet your unique needs, focusing on critical aspects of your music career, such as refining your songs, defining your artist story, identifying your target audience, and enhancing your social media presence, just to name a few.
Whether you're just starting out or looking to elevate your existing career, we've got you covered. Our comprehensive approach ensures you get insights on everything from live shows to branding and marketing strategies. We understand that every artist is unique. That's why our coaching is personalized just for you.
And here's the best part. We offer flexible coaching packages that fit any budget. Choose from individual sessions ranging from 30 to 90 minutes, or save with our discounted 4-session packages. Experience custom sessions designed to enhance your music career, with opportunities for greater savings when you choose bundled sessions. Investing in your musical journey has never been more accessible.
Imagine the clarity and direction you'll gain after just one session. The feedback on your songs, the strategies to grow your audience, and the confidence to perform live, all tailored just for you.
So why wait? Don't let uncertainty hold you back. Join us for your free 15-minute discovery call at book.mubutv.com for a transformative coaching experience that will elevate your music career. That's book.mubutv.com.
Welcome back, Insiders. Today's featured guest is Ryan Dusick, founding member and original drummer of Maroon 5. This was a fascinating conversation, and one that, I know we've been wanting to have for a long time, because it goes into an area that we both really feel is important to have, which is all about mental health. And here we had someone who has been at the top, the very, very top of what most musicians and artists aspire to. 20 million seller.
Debut album.
Tours the world, #1 hits, money, success, playing arenas.
Grammy Awards.
Exactly.
Everything you can imagine.
And then you get the reality.
Right.
You get the reality that it's, and what a fascinating conversation, though. As you guys are going to learn, his journey was quite interesting. He wrote a wonderful book called Harder to Breathe. And what I thought was so fascinating about it is that, he spoke about his memoir almost as therapy. And the idea of, how what was so inspiring to me about this conversation, Eric, was he it's inspiring because he found a new purpose in his life.
Right.
And, you can imagine spending your whole life, as a musician, growing up, dreaming, having the success, achieving that.
Yeah. And then having it all taken away.
Well, yeah, it reminds me of that great line that Rick Rubin says, you can never truly be depressed until all your dreams come true.
Yeah, that's such a mind-blowing quote.
And it's very true.
And it's very true.
Yeah, and Ryan's life and work was kind of an illustration of that. But what's so inspiring is how he found a new sense of purpose.
Right.
And how music and on a creative level, the writing, helped him. It was both a passion and therapy for him. And it highlighted, I think, the healing power of creative expression in a way that helped take him to the next evolution of his creative life as a therapist and how he's helping people now.
Yeah, I also thought one of the things that were interesting to me, this was a very deep episode for me just on a personal level, as you know, Rich, with my struggles and, the whole idea of the stuff that I'm doing now and my commitment with mental health awareness and even the recent, song that I had put out having to do with it. So this was very personal to me. And some of the things that he was saying actually hit me so hard because, you and I always talk about the mirror being put in front of you. And some of the things that he was saying and the experience was exactly the same things that I've gone through and I've experienced. So it was just like he was just talking to me. It was just unbelievable. But one of the things that were really hit home with me was, the pressures of performing. Performing in arenas came with its own pressures, and managing energy during increased downtime was a real challenge. I think you brought up the quote of, was it Mick Jagger?
It was Mick Jagger.
Yeah, from the Stones, talking about how do you spend the rest of the...
Well, how do you, how have you, what's the secret to touring?
Right, with the secret to touring, and it's what you do in the other 22 hours. And
of the day.
Yeah, and it's such a wise quote from him.
That only someone who has toured for 40-something years could say.
Right, and we're talking about somebody like Ryan that back in that time, mental health was not top of mind and was not in the forefront like it is today. And so he was already, riding against the current from the offset, and, he was dealing with all that. And so I guess just, one of the things that he was realizing was just that pressure of like, you have to perform night after night at such a high level because you've reached the mountaintop. It's trying to keep that pace up. And that's what I, was one of the things that was a really interesting point that he was bringing up about how that plus all the other things that he was dealing with inside that people, I guess, weren't really understanding where he was coming from was taking a toll.
Absolutely. And to further that point, Eric, of what you were just talking about, one of those things specifically that he spoke of was the imposter syndrome.
Right.
And I think that that's very common. It's not only common for musicians and for very, very successful artists, but it's common for people who are at the top of their field in other businesses. That feeling of like, God, if they find out that I'm not the real thing.
Right.
And that's from people who are performing in front of 20,000 people a night.
Exactly.
To thousands of screaming fans around the world who are, 20 million albums sold and
that's the insecurity of the artist that we all have. I have it, you and I have talked about that. It's something that everybody I think has inherently. So.
Yes. And and it's that journey of, I am worthy, I am good enough, and how that syndrome, it will affect you no matter, at what level you're at. This is why that Rick Rubin quote, I think, was so impactful,
mind-blowing,
because so many times we not only have that, but we feel like, I think the whole purpose of the Rubin quote was, when I get that number one album, then I'll be happy.
We romanticize all these things. We were talking about that earlier.
That they will fill the hole.
Right.
That they will fill
the void. I'll
void
finally feel complete.
Yeah, if I get that
$1 million.
And when
you get that, exactly.
And you're in the same place and you are the exact same person and you haven't changed a bit.
That's the hardcore, and that's why it's such a mind-blowing quote. Every time you mention that quote, it's just so life-altering because you do realize, like you said, that's why money, success, none of that stuff really matters, because when you get it, you're still the same person. And that's the irony of the whole situation, is that you do get to that mountaintop like Ryan did, and that wasn't what was, working for him.
Exactly.
Yeah. And one of the other areas that I thought was, self-care importance, and what he talked about, self-care became essential, especially rest and managing circadian rhythms to maintain our performance levels. Again, these guys went from the drawing board to the big time. And it's like everything that they set out to do was working and it was firing on all cylinders, yet there was things that were missing with Ryan, and those things started to take a toll. So it's a very interesting story that I think people are going to be really blown away with.
Yeah. It's kind of that old adage, everywhere you go, there you are.
Yeah.
You can't get away from that. And the success only exacerbates that. You will never escape that. And that's why it's about, making peace, acceptance, so important, even at the highest levels. And I think, to the point you were making before, which I think is a very important point, in the era that they came up, that kind of thing just wasn't talked about. And we can mention, whether it was the Cobains or the
Chris
Cornells or the Lane Staleys, or those people that died along the way, whose mental health wasn't being taken care of. And throughout history, where excessive use. And one of the things that I think is so important is the fact that this is now being focused on. This is now being prioritized. And, we're only the better for it.
And with that, insiders, sit back, relax, and enjoy our featured conversation with Ryan Dusick.
Ryan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. We always like to start these conversations with a question, especially to someone like yourself who was or is a musician. Do you remember the moment, if there was one, when you knew that music was going to be your professional career path?
That's a good question. I had been playing around town in LA. I grew up in LA, and my older brother was a guitarist before I was a drummer. And, I think the reason why I started playing the drums was just because I wanted to be in his band, and the drummer was the weak link. So I figured I could get in there if I learned to play the drums. But I didn't think of it as a professional endeavor. I thought of it as just something that would be a fun thing to do, to play around town. I think it probably wasn't until I started the band, originally called Cars Flowers, that was later called Maroon 5, with Adam, Jesse, and Mickey when I was 16 years old. Again, when we first started, it was just a fun thing to do. We just wanted to book some shows around town and have our friends come and see us play. But pretty quickly, I would say within a year or two of having started the band, we were getting some interest from record labels. And that's when it started to creep in that it was like, well, this might have a chance to go somewhere. And then there was this fateful evening when we were playing a midnight show on New Year's in Malibu, and this independent record producer came walking down the beach and heard us jamming and came walking in. We just so happened to have recorded our first demo that day, so we had something to hand him. And he was just kind of blown away that we were so young and that we were so precocious. And it seemed that very quickly things were moving towards some kind of record deal and some kind of, a chance to actually make a go of this. I think that's when we all started to think maybe this is actually something that's going to be a career. Of course, our parents were excited, but also cautious to be overly excited about the prospects of what that was going to lead to.
Ryan, I wanted to ask you, on Maroon's 5 debut for Octone, you had extraordinary success. And, in your powerful and unflinching memoir, Harder to Breathe, you write about how you first began experiencing the physical and mental toll of your nerve injury and anxiety. At the time, what internal messages were you telling yourself about your self-worth, and how did you ultimately come to understand these struggles as part of your personal journey?
Well, it was very difficult and confusing at the time because I didn't really have a real clear understanding of what was happening. I think looking back, I have more clarity now. I always put a lot of pressure on myself to perform at a high level, and that wasn't just with the drums, that was with everything. I was a high achieving kid. Was kind of a perfectionist, not kind of, I was definitely a perfectionist by nature, and could be kind of obsessive compulsive and really just expect everything to be just right. The drums had been my escape from that. It had been fun, and it had been connection and just a cathartic release, kind of banging it out on the drums until, the band got to a point where every single performance was at a high level and really important because we were supporting this album that was going somewhere. And we, every other day we were getting offers now to play on late night shows and to, open for acts in arenas. And so I was stepping up to another level when all of a sudden it wasn't just the passion and the inspiration and the fun. It was now a gig that required to perform at the highest level. And I think that's when the pressure, both external and internal, started creeping in, and the self-doubt at the same time. I definitely experienced imposter syndrome, which I think, people in every industry experience at different levels. But for me, I think I felt that it was based in reality because I had never really learned music or the drums. I was a self-taught drummer. I never learned proper technique. I never learned even rudiments or anything like that. I had just watched MTV and emulated my heroes. And so all of a sudden you find yourself in the midst of this international campaign for the success of that album, Songs About Jane, and playing on live TV on Saturday Night Live and things like that. And it just started hitting me like I feel really ill prepared for this level of performance. And watching, the other performers around me that were at a very high level, a lot of the pop artists that we were playing with now, because you have to remember, we were a garage band when we started out. We were playing in the 90s with a lot of alternative acts. And then all of a sudden we're playing with pop acts who had very accomplished musicians who were trained and had gone to Juilliard and Berklee School of Music and stuff like that. So I just felt that imposter syndrome. I was putting a lot of pressure on myself. I didn't realize that anxiety was a big issue for me until it started to really creep up. And then on top of that, I was having these physical problems that had to do with old sports injuries. I was a pitcher in high school. And you put that all together with the amount that we were being asked to do, the pressure that we were under every day, traveling and performing at that level. And it was just kind of a toxic brew where the negative thoughts became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The pain that I was experiencing started, turning into lack of coordination, like nerve problems. And it all just kind of fed on itself in a way that was really hard to understand at the time because it was so confounding and felt debilitating. I think the only thing that really resonated with me, and I never really expressed this to anyone except myself, was there's something wrong with me. There's something defective in me. I can't put my finger on it. I can tell it's not just this injury in my shoulder. It's not just that I'm tired. There's something really wrong, and this is going to end really badly for me. So of course, when you're ruminating on those types of thoughts, it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy because you're in the same way that, the power of positive thought can lead to, better outcomes. The power of negative thought can lead to that as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting listening to you because, you've spoken about something that you don't hear too often spoken about, which is the idea that, when you got into that level, suddenly you weren't a garage band anymore. Suddenly everything, musically, professionally, playing wise, all had to be elevated up, and you felt that kind of pressure. And I remember in your book, which is a very powerful memoir, Harder to Breathe, you explored that intriguing intersection of your extraordinary success with Maroon 5 and your deep commitment to your mental health. Despite selling 20 million albums, winning 2 Grammys, touring the world, achievements that I think many would consider the pinnacle of a musician's career, you describe a profound paradox, which I thought was fascinating. It was experiencing external success while struggling with debilitating internal pain. And you write about, the anxiety as a teenager long before you even knew what it was. And my question, Ryan, is how did those early experiences shape the way you understood your mental health in later years, especially during the pressures of huge success with Maroon 5?
Well, thank you first off for the kind words about the book. The book Harder to Breathe is really, it was a passion project for me. It was something that it came at a time in my life when I was really feeling a lot of purpose and drive to be of service in a lot of different ways. And the book was kind of the culmination of a lot of things for me. I think it also served as a form of therapy for me to go back and look at all this stuff and try to find the through line, the narrative of how these things came about, how they became issues for me, and I've made sense of them and tried to turn that story into something that's now empowering for me at this later point in my life. Starting out, the first times that I experienced anxiety, I think as a kid, I was a shy kid, and I was, pretty successful in a lot of things that I did, in baseball, in academics, and other things. But the one thing that was always challenging for me was new social situations. I didn't feel really comfortable outside of my comfort zone in that regard. And so I always had a pretty small circle of friends, and I was kind of a homebody. I wasn't really like an adventurous soul in terms of having new experiences and meeting new people. And then, of course, you can imagine being in high school and having that type of personality. It was the first time that I just felt what I now know was anxiety, just a kind of discomfort in my surroundings, a discomfort in my own body. I describe it as like a lump in my throat and an inability to kind of catch my breath, and almost feeling sort of disconnected from my surroundings, walking around and either feeling like I was hyperventilating or not getting enough air and almost feeling lightheaded. Now I would say that's probably called dissociation. That's the word we would use in the mental health world. But really, I couldn't understand it at the time, because this was the 90s, early 90s, long before there was the pop psychology movement we have today and the common discourse that we talk about anxiety and mental health the way that we do today. So, I felt like I was alone. Like, am I the only person experiencing this? Am I the only person who feels weird and like I'm just not present? But, music was so powerful for me, because that was a place where I felt relief from those things. Because banging on the drums was cathartic. It was release. It was freedom. It was an escape from the expectations that being at a pretty elite college prep high school presented. And it was the place where I felt understood by the music that I was listening to. This was, my heroes were Kurt Cobain and Eddie Vedder and Chris Cornell and all the music of the early 90s. At that time in my life, it was just perfect timing for feeling teenage angst and feeling, just disillusioned and disconnected and disaffected. It was the music of that time was so connecting for me, and it felt like those artists understood me. And so making music and performing it with my buddies who had, similar taste and loved the same music, that was the place where I felt relief from all those things. I felt connected. I felt like I wasn't anxious. I was just doing it because it was so fun and such a almost therapeutic experience. And that's what it was for the longest time with the band. Like I said, until we were at the higher levels of having pressure to perform. And then that's when those things, that latent anxiety, the things that I've been pushing down or avoiding and escaping, I now understand it was there. I hadn't really dealt with it. I'd just been kind of putting a Band-Aid on it or finding ways to not deal with it head on, until I had to deal with it head on, because I was putting so much pressure on myself internally, and then there was so much pressure externally. And it was really difficult to grapple with for, a reason that you kind of put your finger on, which is that externally we were having more and more success. The level of what we'd been, working for a decade just kept rising, and it was one, gold or platinum plaque after another, and one more, celebratory dinner with Clive Davis, or, meeting our heroes and going to the Grammys. And in the midst of all that, I was breaking down physically, emotionally, psychologically, and just feeling like, I didn't deserve any of the success, feeling like I was a phony, feeling like this was all going to end really badly. And so it was this really difficult intersection between what was the fantasy, the dream come true, and then also my worst nightmare sort of happening beneath the surface at the same time.
Ryan, your book really captures the complexities of both youth and success. You explore the exhilaration and the pain that comes with them. As your story unfolds, you speak to the deeper journey of finding balance, peace, and meaning once the noise of fame began to fade. What were the key moments for you, or realizations that guided you towards this shift in your own life?
Well, I really had to suffer and hit a bottom. Not everyone does necessarily have to hit a bottom. I'm not a believer that, whether it's addiction or otherwise, that you have to necessarily, hit a rock bottom in order to find clarity and to find peace and eventually, come back up the other side of that valley. And fortunate for me, it wasn't a bottom that left me destitute or, the kind of things that people can really have to struggle through, like, legal consequences or losing, all of their finances or their family. Or for me, it was really just a spiritual bottom. I had been struggling after I left the band for about a decade, from 2006 to 2016, really just dealing with the grief of that loss. The loss was profound. It was the loss of my whole identity. It was everything that was to the core of my self-definition, because I had made the band that for me, and I had made everything we did the meaning and the purpose of my life. And so without that, I didn't know who I was. And I think, went through all the stages of grief in losing that identity. I was angry. I was angry at the band. I was angry at God or the universe. Really, I was angry at myself more than anyone. I felt that I had done it to myself. And so I was depressed, and I was anxious, and I was bargaining, and I was drinking a lot and trying to self-medicate. And there's no avoiding it. You have to go through the pain to get to the other side of it. And for me, it was when the addiction got bad enough and the anxiety that kept getting worse was getting bad enough that I just didn't want to live that way anymore. And so I essentially had this spiritual bottom that I was feeling disconnected from life, disconnected from any sense of meaning or purpose in my life. And I had a choice to make. When you get to that place in life, when you feel really broken, you either are throwing in the towel or you're deciding, well, I'm going to give this thing called life another shot and see what it has for me. And the only way that that's going to happen is if I start walking in the other direction towards recovery. And so it was really just being humbled and having a bit of clarity that came from the acceptance of recognizing that it may not have been my fault that I ended up where I was, but I was certainly doing things to contribute to my staying there. And I didn't want to do that anymore. So it was surrendering to the fact that my way of coping was not really helping. It was actually making things worse, and that I needed some program of recovery to get me moving in the right direction. And so it was in the recovery from those things, first and foremost from alcoholism, but then in quick succession dealing with the other mental health challenges that I'd been grappling with, provided me both clarity and relief, and then also just the vision of what my life could be and what my perspective would be on these things moving forward. Pretty early on in recovery, I discovered service as a way of getting out of self-obsession and kind of reconnecting with life and feeling like I have something to offer, which was something I had not felt in a long time. And so when I felt that, I just kind of wanted more of it, and it became very fulfilling to be of service, to first just in rehab, just being helpful to my peers. But then once I was, 6 months into recovery, I started volunteering at a recovery center and just doing peer support and being a co-leader of groups. And this was just another level of education, another level of service, and of just kind of realizing that there was more to this life for me than the past that I've been grappling with trying to let go of. It was easier to find closure on that chapter of my life because I now had a new chapter. And that led to me kind of realizing that I could continue to do this as a volunteer, or maybe I could pursue it as a career. And I ended up applying to a graduate program for a master's in clinical psychology, thinking that I would just work at a drug rehab place or something like that. But it continued to sort of expand my horizons, and one thing after another, I found new purpose and new drive to do things that would ultimately be very fulfilling. So I became a therapist. In the course of that graduate program, I realized that this tragic story I'd been telling myself about, loss and depression and addiction had a happy ending now. It had another chapter where things shifted to this whole new sense of purpose and connection. And so advocacy and being of service on a bigger scale became a new passion for me. And that's where the book came in. That's where I started. It wasn't even that I had a thought or an idea. It just started coming out of me. I just felt like this is the next logical step. I need to start putting this story down on paper. And so that became very purposeful for me. And since then, each thing I've done has kind of led to the next purposeful thing, the next indicated action. Putting a book out in the world led to me speaking publicly more, doing more advocacy work in that regard, and then starting my own podcast, the Harder to Breathe podcast. So it's just been, it continues to be an education. It continues to be just really me following my new sense of purpose and wanting to just have a life that feels fulfilling. I spent a decade avoiding responsibility and avoiding things that were uncomfortable and new and challenging outside of my comfort zone. And now I've just realized I've kind of gotten addicted to pursuing things that are challenging and that broaden my horizons, because that's where the good stuff is. That's where the growth is. And so that is kind of what has realigned my perspective, and mental health and psychology in general are just passions of mine that I think it's the through line of everything that I do at this point. I'm even going back and talking about music and stuff like that. I come from a different perspective now. I'm being on this side of all that stuff that was so hard.
Yeah, it's so fascinating listening to you, just hearing your own journey. And one of the things that I remember, I read an interview with you where you spoke about stepping into discomfort as a key to creative and personal growth. And how do you think, mental health struggles, including your own experiences with perfectionism, OCD, have influenced your creative work? And have they shaped your writing in ways that you had not anticipated?
Yeah, I think that I don't know if I'll ever escape the perfectionistic tendencies I have completely, but I think that what I've discovered that has been really helpful for me is the difference between pursuing excellence and pursuing perfection. For a decade after leaving the band, I was working on music. I was doing some producing and some writing and things, but for the most part, I was avoiding creating things that were my own because nothing just ever seemed good enough. It was the perfectionism was crippling, not just because I had that tendency, but also because, I had been in this band and worked with them for a decade, and that had been really fulfilling. And we had gotten to the place where we were making hits. And so I'd had that experience of doing something at the highest level. And everything I did after that just seemed to kind of pale in comparison, especially because they were still doing it. They were out there still selling out arenas and making top 40 hits and number one hits. And so for me, it was really difficult to be creative for a long time there, or at least to do anything that was my own, until I went back to school and, started that master's program, because now I had to turn in papers and things. There wasn't really any, ifs, ands, or buts about it. There was an assignment. It had to be done. I had to just turn it out and surrender to it, just turning it in, and it's never really done. You just surrender to it, And I think that I realized quickly, because it forced me to do that. Number one, I remembered that I loved writing. I had my undergrad degree was in English at UCLA, and I had forgotten how much I enjoyed writing, that the process was really fulfilling and enjoyable, and that I was pretty good at it. Without thinking it was perfect, I was getting A's. And so that just, it built my confidence back up. A lot of the things I was doing helped me build my confidence back up, because my self-esteem was shot after I left the band. I really felt really knocked down, and like I didn't really have a lot of self-worth. And so feeling like I had these new talents and getting a lot of support, first from my recovery community, a lot of love and support from those people. And then, back in school and studying and realizing I had something to offer, and that I don't know if there were things that I had learned in the process of working through my issues, or if it was stuff that had always been there and I just hadn't been able to acknowledge it. But I just had this new skill set. And I think that when I sat down to write my book, I realized it's okay to strive for excellence, to want something to be as good as it can be. But excellence is a process. Perfection is just a comparison against an unrealistic ideal, right? Excellence can be where you assume you're going to fail, you're going to do something, and it's going to not be up to the level that you'd like it to be. You're going to learn from that process, and you're going to apply it, and you're going to move forward and continue to get better. But you never really get there. It's just a process of pursuing excellence. Whereas perfectionism is everything you do, you're comparing it to the ideal, and so you're always failing. So with pursuing excellence, you're always succeeding, even if you fail. And with perfectionism, you're always failing. And so that was a big shift for me. I realized that, like, at the same time that the perfectionism can be crippling, at certain times in my life, it was the thing that drove the greatest things I was able to work on. I mean, within the band, it's not like we had anything but the highest level of standard of what we were doing. We pushed each other, we pushed ourselves. For whatever reason, in that context, it worked really well. I think the combination of personalities was complementary in that regard. But for me, in my own personal endeavors, I think I had to come to that place where I realized I can embrace that passionate part of myself that wants to make something great and take on a project in that way, but just not be so hard on myself in comparing it to perfection, because perfection is an illusion.
Yeah, Ryan, so much of your story as I'm listening to this is resonating with me personally so much. And there must be some through line with people that struggle with this, with the perfectionism idea and everything, because I'm a musician, a recording artist, just like yourself, released a recent single that the whole basis is on mental health awareness and the struggles that I've been through and what I've dealt with. And just hearing you, everything that you're saying, it sounds like, I've done deep therapy, and I feel like the mirror is being put in front of me right now, because all the things that you're saying and expressing are the things that I've dealt with perfectionism and trying to, compare yourself and everything. And, what I wanted to ask you was, you said that your vulnerability, honesty, and wit were key elements of your journey towards healing. As someone who is in the public eye as a successful musician, how has that process influenced your work as a therapist?
Well, it's interesting. There are all different kinds of therapists, and traditionally therapists tend to hold their cards pretty close to their vest. It's not encouraged that there are different styles, but in general, you don't overshare for good reason. You don't bring too much of yourself in, because it's about the client, and you're there to advocate for them, to collaborate with them on their challenges and their strengths. I feel that because of my past, the things that I've gone through in my life, I can really relate to my clients, and oftentimes they can really relate to me. And it does become a challenge also because I was in a known band before, that it's pretty easy for people to discover my past and for me to remain, totally anonymous, blank slate as a therapist. So a lot of times people come in and they already know a lot about me, and I have a book out in the world, I have a lot of music out in the world and all that. So for me, being in the room as a therapist, doing the work that I do, both as a therapist and a coach and as a speaker, I probably bring more of myself into the room than a lot of therapists do. And I'm not afraid to be vulnerable and to share, times when the things that a client is sharing with me aligns with things I have experience with. You always have to be mindful of not oversharing, not making it about you, of always checking in with yourself. Like, what is my reason for wanting to be vulnerable in this moment? What is my reason for sharing this story? Because if it's about me, either wanting to make it about me or to whatever is the self-gratifying reason, obviously that's not a good reason to do it. But if this could be really helpful to this client, or if this could be a situation in which they realize that I understand what they're going through. There's going to be an empathic connection if I share this story, because I've been through something very similar to what they're going through. And also, is there wisdom that's gained in the process of going through those things that I maybe have gained just because I've been through it, and that I can share with them to help them along in their journey. So I do think that I self-disclose more than some, or more than a lot, and that I've just found that vulnerability is just a rare commodity. People that are willing to be truly vulnerable and give of themselves in that way, it's more rare than I had even thought. Now that I've kind of made a business of it, I understand why a lot of people are hesitant to be vulnerable, and especially in certain industries. And if you have a career, or if you're a public figure performing at a high level, if you're a CEO of a company, like, you don't want it getting out that you're struggling with something, or that you have something in your past that's a demon. So there's a lot of reasons why people avoid vulnerability, but the most of the time the reason why is because it's uncomfortable. They don't want to go there. They don't want to sit with the vulnerability, with the feeling of what they may call weakness, or might call, essentially an insecurity. So for me to model that, whether it be in the therapy room, or just when I'm speaking, or when I wrote my book, hopefully that goes towards destigmatizing that, and allowing people to walk through a process where if they can sit with their vulnerability and get more comfortable with it, then they can actually address the things that are challenging them. rather than running away from it or avoiding it or putting a Band-Aid on it in the way that I did for a long time. We do, all of us are guilty of that. I mean, we do it.
Absolutely.
You don't have to be an addict to relate to that. And we find you could be you're just a workaholic or somebody who, distracts yourself in other ways from dealing with the insecurities and the anxieties.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Ryan, with your unique perspective as both a highly successful musician and a dedicated mental health professional, are you encouraged about growing the conversation around mental health within the music industry and by the steps being taken to better support musicians and artists that are facing these challenges?
I am encouraged, definitely. Since I, started promoting the book, and then I wrote an article for Variety magazine that was about touring and mental health. And I started getting a lot of people reaching out to me from a world that I didn't know existed, which, is a relatively new thing. There's these organizations, some of them nonprofit, some of them for-profit, but just different groups advocating for mental health as a priority within the music industry. I joined a collective called the Music Industry Therapist Collective, which are a group of therapists who previously worked in the music industry in different capacities and are now working with people that are currently working in the music industry. And look, I wish this stuff existed 20 years ago when I was going through it. There just wasn't really a dialogue. There wasn't an advocacy. And I look back and I think to myself, when we were going out on the road about to promote the album Songs About Jane and go on the most challenging 4-year ride of our lives, just nonstop touring and travel and promoting the thing. Essentially, we got a good pep talk and we got the record label telling us, how to represent ourselves and the kind of things you need to be mindful of in terms of when you're on camera and, being media ready and all those things. But, it could have just as easily been like, well, here are the pitfalls. Here are the things that are going to be challenging in terms of how to stay sane, how to take care of yourself in the midst of, and inherently challenging and high pressure situation, inherently unbalanced lifestyle. But that just wasn't a priority. It wasn't something that people were talking about at that time. And people are talking about it now. I think that the argument that I made in this article that I wrote in Variety magazine was, I think historically the challenge has been, well, where are the resources going to come from? It's a shoestring budget for any album these days, for any touring, until you're, at the level like Taylor Swift, where it's, just making money hand over fist. On any level, it's all about the bottom line. It's a business and an industry just like any other industry. So who's going to be paying for the things that are going to be resources for people? My argument is, well, look, any business is only as good as how sustainable it is. And if you're building a product that's not sustainable, then you might make money in the short run, but there's going to be an end date. And so if you're not prioritizing the things that make your artists' careers sustainable, their lives sustainable, and your crew and the people who are working within your organization, if the lifestyle and the priorities and the ways in which you're advocating for those people is not sustainable, then you're going to run into problems sooner or later. So I think it's just good business. I think it's good sense to be mindful of the fact that these are human beings and that it's a challenging industry. There's a high pressure, highly competitive industry. And you're dealing with creative people that probably got into the entertainment business for reasons that people, it's not just like any other industry in that regard. Creative people are a bit different and have different proclivities. And so being mindful of people's predispositions and what's going to be challenging about that lifestyle. And just like for me, how, the internal pressures meet up with the external pressures and that causes a problem. It's a unique situation where you have to plan for those things. And I think it's just good business to try to create a sustainable model.
Hey, Insiders, we hope that you've been enjoying our featured interview. Stay tuned because we've got so much more value coming your way. But before we dive back in, a word from our sponsor.
Hey, Eric, as an artist, what do you find are the most challenging aspects to a music career, especially when you're starting out?
Well, I think one of the first things is just trying to get the direction of who you are as an artist, where you want to go, where you want to be. And, we've talked about it on the show a lot. Who is your target audience? Who you are? What do you stand for? What do you believe in? what do you think would resonate with an audience? And so those are some of the things that I would feel being a new artist. Obviously what I know now is different because I know these things, but for people that are out there like our audience that don't have necessarily any direction to go would be the first things that I would start off with.
And having the songs that
Absolutely.
incorporate those elements that you're speaking of into it. That's so important today.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why we started MUBUTV and why we started this new consulting service that we're offering to all of our insiders out there, because that is another one of the big things. I mean, that is the big thing, is like having the great songs. That's what it really starts off. Our friend Don Grierson always said, it always starts with a great song. So that's probably, besides putting together what your audience and what your target audience is the single most important thing. Where are your songs at currently today? Are you collaborating with people? Are you trying to go out to networking events where you can connect with other songwriters and stuff like that? So
yeah, and what are your strengths?
Exactly.
You know, are you a strong lyric writer? Are you a strong melody writer? Are you a strong musician, a player?
Right.
You know, and it's really important to get really strong clarity on those issues before proceeding.
I totally agree, Rich. And, you know, with our consulting services, we offer a myriad of different packages and we've made it super affordable for everybody. So, you know, if you guys are interested out there in connecting with us on a coaching call, you can visit book.mubutv.com and start off with a free 15-minute discovery call.
Well, yeah, absolutely. That we start with an initial 15-minute call where we can get a sense of who you are, what are the issues that you specifically have, right, and want to work on.
Exactly.
And we can go from there. Absolutely.
Yeah, and we tailor everything to your needs. It's not like a cookie cutter thing. We kind of really want to get to know who you are as an artist, where you at today, what's the snapshot of you as an artist today, and then start trying to craft something that's tailor-made for you. So again, if you're interested, visit us at book.mubutv.com for your 15-minute discovery call. Yeah. Do you see a world, Ryan, where in the future, maybe mental health professionals traveling with touring acts and stuff like that becomes something of the norm?
I do. I think that's probably happening to a certain extent already. But again, obviously only at the highest level because that's expensive. But I think that there are other ways to do it. I think that, you know, I look back, it would have been helpful even just to have like one meeting or like a month of group therapy with the band or with our band and tour manager, just to kind of like get our heads on straight and realize like we need to be our own support system. You know, we need to be a family that supports one another. And if anyone's struggling, like it's on all of us to take care of each other. I think that some bands have that, some don't, some crews have it, some don't. In general, if you're talking about a business, if you're not prioritizing that, then it's likely to fall by the wayside. And you just, I mean, when I was on the road, it was expected, you know, the crew, you know, they show up and they do their work. They're there before you. They're there after you leave. And once they're done, you know, they kind of tie one on and try to get through the next haul. And it's like, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of long hours and you're just kind of burning the candle at both ends. And it's like, well, who's taking care of these people? If you're not making that a priority, sooner or later, you're going to deal with burnout at best. You know, if not worse.
Yeah, that's why I was asking about that. Yeah, that's why I was asking about that, because I feel that like what you're saying, there needs to be advocacy. Like you're saying, it's a business, of course, it's got to make money, but I agree with you that there has to be some sort of support system. Maybe, like you said, having group counseling, that's like such a great thing just in general for bands. I don't know if you saw the documentary Metallica, Some Kind of Monster. That's like the perfect, I mean, you know, thing of where like group therapy is needed. And so before these problems arise, just both personally and as a group, I think that's a great idea. Even if it's something that they can't go on the road with them, but maybe when they're off the road or they're in between, you know, dates that they can, you know, have those sessions. That's what I was getting back to, because you were saying that there should be an advocacy there towards keeping everything afloat. And a lot of that has to do with that mental health, you know, awareness. And so I just thought that would be an interesting thing to see if that's something that's, you know, you were saying that that's kind of being done now, but probably at the highest levels, maybe at a Taylor Swift level, but you know, why not for everybody, you know, make that something that's part of an insurance thing that musicians get. And that's something that's provided with therapists through that organization that you mentioned, for instance, the music industry one that you mentioned that was former musicians and people of the industry. I think that would be a great way to kind of tie that all in.
I think that, you know, there's a lot of ways to do it that doesn't require you to carry a therapist in your bus with you. I think that you know, doing preemptive work, being proactive rather than reactive. Because if you wait until somebody has a major drug problem or they have a psychotic break, or whatever it is that's becomes a real problem, then it's a little late in the game, right? So you have to be mindful of the fact that these are realities. How many stories do we need to hear of Kurt Cobain's and Chris Cornell's and the people that I loved that are gone? So being mindful of that ahead of time, being proactive, and providing tools, providing resources, giving people tools to try to work through this stuff before it gets to that point, and then having pit stops. If it's between tours, if it's at points along the tour, if it's, I think that some of these organizations are creating it's festival grounds and places where musicians and crew end up sooner or later having resources available to them there. I think short of having, every touring artist carrying a therapist or whatever else with them in their crew, there are ways to advocate and to just work it into the program. It's not as cumbersome as you'd think in terms of cost.
Yeah, it's so interesting. As you guys were discussing this, a quote came to mind that I never ever forgot, and it's totally related to what we're speaking about. So someone was asking, I guess it was on the 50th anniversary of something. They were talking to Mick Jagger, and the guy asked him at one point. They said, Mick, you have been out on the road for 50 years now. What is the secret to successful touring? And I will never forget his answer, because I thought, only someone with the wisdom and the knowledge of 50 years could say this. And he said totally, seriously, he said, the secret to touring for 50 years successfully is knowing what to do with the other 22 hours of the day.
Yeah.
And I thought, that there's a lot of wisdom in that. And you have spoken over the last 10, 15 minutes about the very deep nature of that kind of work, of what that means, and, all of the pieces and elements, because you can see what happens when people don't spend, the time in the right way. Don Henley also spoke about that. He said, it's so important to have routines and to have, activities and things you do. He said, Jagger went on to express that, he said, if you don't have that, he said, that's how you end up with addiction. He said, that's what happened to Charlie Watts. He said, Charlie got into terrible, terrible problems in the latter part of his life with heroin addiction, because he sat in his room all day and just waited until we banged on the door to say, ready to go to the gig. And he said, that's what led to those kinds of, and it's, I guess my point is that even at that level, it's so important to watch for the pitfalls, because they're there. And I guess I want to ask you, Ryan, considering that exhaustion and mental strain are often key factors in performance cancellations, what, in your opinion, are some proactive steps that artists can take to monitor and support their mental health before these challenges escalate in their own careers?
Well, first off, that quote that you quoted of Mick Jagger, it resonates a lot, because I had two different experiences on the road, because in the 4 years between when we made Songs About Jane and when that touring cycle ended, it was a big arc from climbing the mountain to being at the top of the mountain. And the first 2 years of that, we released our first single and released the album about 6 months into touring. We were already on the road for 6 months before it even came out. And then it was a year promoting the first single, very gradually building a fan base to the point where a year and a half in, we did our first small headlining tour and had a gold record and a moderate hit at radio. So it was 2 years into touring when we released our second single, This Love, and that was the one that came out internationally and became the big top 40 hit. So the first 2 years of our journey in that regard was very different than the next 2 years. We were driving around mostly in a van, just the band and a couple crew guys, the tour manager and the guitar tech, and it was a lot of brushing our teeth in the parking lot of a. In the mornings we go into a radio station with our acoustic gear, or go into a local distribution center, and we were just like hustling and getting one radio ad at a time, and then doing sound check and schmoozing with the local reps, and then playing in some club, and then driving for 8 hours, doing the same thing the next day. And so it was long hours and not a lot of sleep and a lot of hustle and a lot of physical exhaustion. But it was also a lot of fun. It was a lot of stimulation. There wasn't a lot of downtime that you had to account for other than just the long drives. In that context, you can imagine why people end up needing a stimulant, just to keep going, and how to come down at some point when you do actually finally have a period of time at a motel when you can try to get some rest. How do you come down from all that energy?
Yeah.
So that was one challenge in terms of why people end up with problems in that context. But then all of a sudden we're headliners, and when you get to the point when you're playing arenas and you're in a bus and you can sleep on the bus, you have a bunk. When you pull into town, it's much earlier and you're leaving at 4 in the morning. You're basically in one place for a long period of time. You can't really go out and do much because you're stuck in there. And if you're playing that place, if you walk outside, you're liable to get mobbed and not be able to get back inside for 2 hours. And then you have interviews and things and a lot of downtime just sitting around in basically locker rooms in the innards of an arena. So it's opposite problem is there's not a lot of stimulation for a lot of hours. There's a lot of downtime. And then all of a sudden at a certain point at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, you all of a sudden have to get up and have all this energy and be your most dynamic self and put on a big rock show. And then just 2 hours later, figure out how to come down from that and get some rest for the next day. And so it's a different set of challenges in terms of just your energy, your circadian rhythm, how to maintain some kind of balance in, again, what's an inherently unbalanced lifestyle. And so it's a little bit different for the musician who's on their way up than for the headliner, but it's the same challenge just in terms of how do you find some normalcy? How do you take care of yourself when your lifestyle doesn't have the kind of structure to it that provides self-care? And I think that you just have to be that much more mindful of the things that you're presenting and that this lifestyle is presenting as challenges to your psyche and to your body. I think when you're in your 20s and you're in a rock band, you don't want to be thinking necessarily about, how well you're eating or getting exercise or how you're feeding your mind as much as your body. You're living the dream. You want to live like a rock star and all that stuff, but that's okay for a certain amount of time. I'm not a purist in terms of you have to be a saint all the time, but you have to remember that when you're burning the candle at both ends, sooner or later it's going to catch up with you. And I think for me, because it was so much stress, my way of coping sometimes was, I got to burn off some steam. I got to go out and drink. I got to enjoy this a little bit. And it's some of those times I would have been better served just to make sure I got some sleep, and number one, just rest, getting enough rest, however you can is a pretty fundamental thing. When you're traveling all the time and when you're exerting yourself that much, you got to prioritize that. But there's a lot of different elements to self-care. It's not rocket science. I mean, there's basic things that give us nourishment and allow us to perform at the highest level. But it's also, it's part of what we've already discussed in terms of the group element is supporting one another. I wish that I had an ability to talk about the things that I was feeling more when I was feeling them. I have a feeling that, the guys in my band probably would have been more understanding than I gave them credit for. They probably would have been more supportive. It's just that being a young man and it being 20 years ago, I had that stigma of appearing weak, of, allowing my vulnerabilities to the surface. I was just kind of trying to tough it out, but then inside feeling really beat down. And it would have been helpful to be able to share that with somebody. It would have been helpful to get some support. So I think that that's important, knowing how to advocate for yourself, how to unload some of the things you're carrying with you. And then just coping skills, meditation, ways of dealing with the stress that's productive and de-stress rather than actually exacerbate the stress. Because, you go out and drink and it's fun. And I'm not saying you can't do that, but essentially while it feels like a relief in the moment, the next day you have more stress as a result of putting all those toxins in your body. So there's a science and an art to it, in terms of how you best manage all those things. And it doesn't require you being perfect to take it back to the earlier conversation. It's just that, you're essentially an athlete, performing at the highest level at that point. You're asking a lot of your body and the psychology wrapped up in performance. You have to think of it in that way. You have to think of it, what's going to be conducive to me being able to maintain this? and for it to be sustainable for me.
Yeah. And it's fascinating that there's so much more consciousness around those points that you made, around, you can go out and have fun and drink, but, are you doing this as a habit? Is this something you're doing every night? Even if you are in your 20s, I know from my own, element of my 20s, I was, I abused drugs, but you could do that then. But, what was I doing it for? And that's what you come to realize, like this conversation has all been about, what that journey led to. And it leads to a stop, and it leads to, if you're lucky, an examination of what are the reasons that, you're running, and what are you running from? And and to start dealing with that.
And not only that, but I think you must have been struggling too, or part of your logic too, that you've got thousands of people that are paying a lot of money to see you, and you guys better sound good every night. Yeah. So that's got to be something that I would assume was a pressure that was added among all the other myriad of things that you were dealing with at the time.
Yeah, very true. And both of those points, I think that for me, in terms of drinking and just substance use in general, there was a big shift and difference between when I first started drinking in my 20s. It was mostly a way to facilitate good times, feeling good and wanting to enhance it and just have fun with my friends. When it was in that phase, I didn't perceive any real problems. It was when, looking back, it became a way of self-medicating, when it became a way of, I'm doing this and I'm doing it alone more often, or I'm doing it because there's a negative feeling, there's some kind of physical or psychic pain that I'm experiencing that I'm wanting to escape, as opposed to a good feeling that I'm wanting to enhance. When it shifted to that, that's when it started to become problematic. And it wasn't really to that point until I wasn't even playing anymore. And then it became a real problem for me after I left the band. But I think that's a good point that you make in terms of the difference between the two. Like, what is the reason that I'm doing this? Right. Because if you're doing it and it's coming from a place of love and festivity, then you could still end up with a problem. I'm not going to say you still want to be mindful of how much you're doing it, but the chances are that you're going to be more in check in terms of whether or not it becomes toxic or not, because it's coming from a place of connected to something positive. But when you are self-medicating in that way, that's a real dangerous place to be. That can lead to a real habit and a real pattern of self-destruction pretty quickly. And so that is important to be mindful of. Yeah. And then I forget what the second part of that was. Apologize.
Oh, no. We were just bringing up the point of, I just brought up the point too, that I just thought of that, you talked about that metaphor that you use, climbing the mountain, and then you were on top of the mountain, that every night that you guys have to be at the highest level performing, and you got people that are paying a lot of money to come see you guys, that must have been an added pressure of like, you're dealing with all the struggles that you are trying to figure out at that time in your early 20s, not knowing what all of this is happening. And then the added pressure of like, Jesus Christ, we better sound great tonight. If not, it's going to be a problem, so that I'd have to assume that that's like another added pressure of always being on 10 and perfect every time. Getting back to your perfectionism, which I deal with that every day. I'm a perfectionist, and I deal with that struggle that you're talking about to this very day of wanting everything to be at the highest level. So that's why I connect with so much of what you're saying, because I do operate in that level of like, everything has got to be perfect. And, there's a part of it that where it gets unhealthy, and I see that. And so it's just interesting hearing somebody else talking about this, because I feel like you're speaking directly to me, and God knows how many people that are listening to this right now dealing with the same struggles. Yeah,
well, definitely. I think for me, part of the reason why it became so challenging when we started to have a lot of success was because I felt that way. I felt that pressure from day one when we went on the road for the first time, because it's one thing, we would play maybe a couple shows a month when we were playing around LA, and we wanted to put on a good show. We wanted it to be as good as it could be. But really, more than anything, it was like we were anticipating a party. It was like all of our friends are coming down, our families are coming down. We're going to have this big show, and it's going to be fun. And then all of a sudden, you go into the studio and you have a record deal, and there's the tyranny of the red light, I call it. All of a sudden now you're recording this, and it's going to be for posterity. It's going to be there forever. There's a different feeling in the air when you realize, okay, this is now something that has meaning to it. It has purpose to it. And there's industry attached to it. And you just, I don't know, me personally, I can't speak for everyone else, but for me, I could just already feel my muscles clenching more when I'm playing the drums and I see that little red light come on, because I want it to be just right. I want it to be perfect. And I'm feeling the pressure I'm putting on myself as much as anything. And so when we went on the road to promote the record, I think that even if we were playing for 50 people in a club, I was very aware of the fact that this is our one opportunity to turn these 50 people on to our band and our album and to make 50 sales in Wichita, or wherever we were that night. And that, like, the only way that happens is if we're as good as I think we can be. And so I felt that pressure to want to be not just hit everything right when I'm supposed to hit it, but to just be dynamic and to be our best, put on a really epic show. And, I think that intersected with fun to a certain extent because, it was an adrenaline rush and we got up for the show and we felt like we were on our A game. But you do that night after night and you feel that adrenaline rush every single day and the anticipation of it and the pressure of wanting to be at your best. It catches up with you sooner or later. And unfortunately for me, it was like right when we started headlining and now we're playing 90-minute sets instead of 30, 40-minute opening sets. And we're doing that every day. And then also, doing television appearances and radio appearances. That's when I started to really feel it, because we'd be on The Tonight Show or we'd be on Saturday Night Live, which is a little different when you're preparing to be on live TV in front of 10 million people versus, in a club for 50 people, and recognizing like with SNL, we were very, very aware, this is a moment where if this goes well, we're going to literally wake up tomorrow and our lives are going to be different. You're going to get all the numbers from the record label that are going to say, your sales have quadrupled in 3 days or whatever,
right.
If this goes well. And if it doesn't go well, this could be the end of it all, if you really botched it. So that's a moment where you recognize just how impactful performance can be. And then from there forward, because that was the start of 2004, right around the time when This Love was coming out and everything was going to a global scale and we were getting ready to do our first major headlining tours. And now you get the sense that people are coming to the show with expectations. It's not just we need to turn these people on. It's we need to deliver something that people have been, they've spent their money. They've saved up to go to a big rock show. They've been listening to the record. They know it. They know every lyric. They know every drum part. And if I mess it up, if I don't deliver what it is that they're expecting, they're going to know it, And so it was 2 years of pressure that I'd already felt and already put on myself. And now it was literal pressure from the external forces of that level of being on top of the mountain that just compounded it and took it to another level. And so, I think at that point I was fighting a losing battle because I had been playing through all that, the tightness in my body and the pain that I was starting to feel and trying to work through it in the midst of a 90-minute headlining set every night. It was more just me thinking to myself, how am I going to get through this tonight? How am I going to get through this? I got to find some way to get through this. And that's not a good place to be as a performer. Like, you want to be in a place where you're looking forward to, mostly you want to be thinking, how am I going to enjoy this? How can I go out there and really have a great experience doing this and be loose and be free and just connect with the music and connect with the audience when it's no longer that. And it's just, how am I going to get through this? I was pretty far down the road at that point. I don't know if there was much I could do. So again, that's why to me, it's really important to be proactive. Not to wait until it gets to that point, to anticipate that those things will be challenges and to do things proactively to avoid getting to that point where it's untenable.
Indeed. Ryan, beyond your powerful and inspirational memoir, Harder to Breathe, have there been any books or films that were particularly inspiring to you that you can recommend to our listeners?
Particularly about music and performance? Or
it could be about anything that's inspired you, whether it's music related or anything that may have inspired you that you can share with the audience.
Yeah, well, obviously being a therapist now, my life is a little different, and I consume a lot of great books and information about mental health, and one of the things, the whole mindfulness movement, I think, has been great and helpful, and then also it's sort of become stigmatized. A lot of people hear that word and they just kind of roll their eyes.
Right.
And I understand why, because I used to hear that word and I didn't really know exactly what it meant, but it didn't sound helpful to me, because if anything, being a perfectionist, being overthinking, somebody who tended to ruminate and overthink, the idea of being more mindful sounded like, well, I don't need that. I need to be less mindful. I need to not think so much. My mind is my own worst enemy. So there's a book called Full Catastrophe Living, which is written by a guy named John Kabat-Zinn, who's kind of the guru who popularized the mindfulness movement. That was one of the first books that I read when I was in grad school. And I actually had to give a report on it. It was like the first time I had to get up in front of a class and give a lecture on something. And that was a huge deal for me too, because at the end of my drinking and my mental health struggles, I had terrible anxiety. I was basically having a panic attack on a daily basis. And so fast forward a couple of years to me being up in front of a class giving a lecture on mindfulness. It was just mind-boggling that I'd be doing that. And it was another level of therapy for me. It was sort of exposure therapy to be working through it in that way. But I mentioned that just because of the book, that was a really great place for me to start in my education at that level of grad school, because he really just lays out what mindfulness is and isn't in a way that was much easier for me to understand. And just first and foremost, the attitudes and the philosophy of it, and then the application of it. And I really do think we can get out of our way in a lot of ways and really just avoid a lot of the problems that we cause for ourselves if we have that skill set. And it's essentially just acceptance of the present moment, getting out of your own way and living in acceptance of what is rather than what you're interjecting and imposing. And also de-stressing. There's a whole chapter in that book about stress and what it does to the body and the mind and how toxic it can be. And he refers to stress reactivity versus stress response. So much of the time we tend to react to stress either by compounding it with more stress or by trying it with things that actually cause more stress, or just, we're just essentially trying to escape it, as opposed to responding to it in a productive way, using it to our advantage and de-stressing. And I find that to be a really productive way to do it, because I had tried a lot of different kinds of meditation, and I just had decided I was not someone who enjoyed meditation. But it seemed to make me more anxious because when I'm listening to a tape of somebody telling me how to breathe, and I'm like, now I feel like I'm hyperventilating, trying to control my breath. It's like, this is not helping. But it was getting out of my own way. It was realizing I if anything, I'm trying to impose myself too much. I'm trying to impose my will. I'm a control freak, and I just need to let go and accept things as they are and not try to control them so much. So that book, I would say, in a lot of ways changed my life. That pivotal moment. There's been a lot of other books that I've read, and I don't know if any of them are specific to music, but music has obviously at times in my life saved my life, but I go back and I look at and I think about the music that saved my life when I was a teenager, and how grateful I am that music existed at that time, that I felt seen and heard by Nirvana and by Soundgarden, and then I'm also a little bit conflicted now, recognizing that at the same time as it was a source of connection for me, it also was a place that encouraged a bit of self-obsession, because it was trendy to be very self-reflective and to be dark and introspective.
Well, they were struggling themselves. They were all struggling themselves. So that was just a reflection of what you were feeling at that time. So I think that was why you connected with it so much. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just more mindful now that we need connection. We need to feel that we have that support and that source of feeling seen and heard, but we also need things that lift us up. And so there's a balance between those things, and there's a push and pull. A balance is such an important word to everything that I do now. I really do think that so much of the problems that we create for ourselves have to do with living out of balance or living in the extremes too much, and thinking that things have to be either black or white or all or nothing. And really the sanity 9 times out of 10 is in the nuance, in the gray area in between those extremes. And so that's a big component as well in terms of how to maintain something that's more sustainable is when you realize that you're living your life in extremes and thinking in extremes and seeing only two binary options in situations, you're causing yourself a bit more stress than is necessary than if you can live in that mindful place of acceptance of not everything fits into those neat compartments all the time. Sometimes it just is the way that it is, and you have to kind of navigate the balance point between those extremes. That's been really helpful to me.
You know, given your own personal journey, which we've been discussing here in the conversation with mental health, what kinds of advice or practices would you recommend to artists and musicians, new ones that are coming up in the music business today, to, I guess, at least think of or to perhaps recommend or start incorporating into their own lives? Are there any that specifically come to mind that you can recommend as a musician and as a professional?
Yeah, well, I think, first and foremost, self-care is it's not as mysterious a thing, I think, as a lot of people think it is. And it's not, I think when people hear the term self-care, a lot of times they imagine going out of their way to do something like treating themselves, like going to a spa day or something like that. Self-care is very basic. It's fundamental to, it really is just what the phrase says, taking care of yourself. That's the starting point, just making sure you get enough rest, making sure that you eat nourishing food, making sure that you get exercise, that you exercise and stimulate both your body and your mind, and that you work on your relationships. You have healthy relationships, and it's not rocket science. It really is just taking care of yourself and doing things that de-stress and allow you to feel and be healthier. That's kind of a good starting point, but I think that obviously that's true for anyone, regardless of whether you're an artist or a performer or anything. In this day and age, there are unique challenges to all of us in the world that we live in, but there's also unique challenges for creative people. And, I think the age of social media and the world that we live in terms of how to navigate that kind of presence, it's important to be mindful of how toxic that can be and the influence of that. And, I think at any point in history, being a performer and trying to create a sense of self-worth based upon the opinion of others can be detrimental. But now it's like every minute of your life is about the things you're posting and your engagement with your audience and whether or not they like you today, and whether, and down to like, the style of your hair or the clothes you're wearing and everything that you do. The thing that I would remind young people, and I think there is a backlash that's happening in this younger generation now that is recognizing that and realizing how much social media and living your life online in that way can be detrimental and create more anxiety, is to remember that although it feels like connection, it feels like you're connecting with your audience or your friends or whomever you're connecting with online. It's not real connection. And connection is one of the most important things. We're social animals. We're tribal animals. We need real connection in our lives to people, to things that create a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives. And music and art can be that. But the world that we live in now, there's a separator, there's a distance. You hear about these artists now that have a hit song or you're getting like millions of downloads, and they've never even played in front of an audience before, Their very first tour is in front of arenas. And it's like, that can cause problems, I think. I think you have to be mindful of the fact that there's no substitute for real human connection and for fostering the relationship with yourself first and foremost, but the relationship with the people in your life and with your audience. I think that it's important to recognize there's no way to sort of to construct a different reality. Like, nature has its own rules. We have certain basic needs. If we're not meeting those basic needs, we're the ones who are going to suffer. And so if we're not feeding ourselves well, if we're not, giving ourselves exercise and the things that are basic biological needs, we're at a certain point we're gonna struggle. If we're not fostering our most basic human needs in terms of relationship, in terms of not isolating too much, recognizing that it's different to be in a room with other human beings than it is to see them on a screen. And And there's just a lot of the modern world that makes it challenging for all of us, but in particular, I think for people that are in the intensity where their whole livelihood is based around the image that they're presenting in that way.
Ryan, where can people best reach and connect with you?
Well, my website is a good one-stop shop, ryandusick.com. You can I've got stuff on there about my therapy, about coaching, about the book, and my podcast, and speaking engagements. You can reach me through my website, ryandusick.com. But you can also keep up with me on Instagram at Ryan Michael Dusick. Post a lot of stuff, from the podcast, from speaking gigs and things. So a lot of content there in terms of the things that I'm doing. I'm on all the other stuff, but those are the main two, I think.
Ryan, we want to thank you so very much for doing this. This has been a conversation that we have been wanting to have for a very, very long time. You are the very first person that we have spoken to on this topic, and it has been a fascinating and insightful and very, very revealing and moving one for both of us. So we're very, very grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you guys so much. That's very kind of you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's all I can say. Wow. I mean, this is, you and I have been wanting to have this conversation for a long time. And it's one of those things where it's just worked out in the universe. And we have had it with the perfect person.
Perfect person, yeah.
Perfect person. This is a man who combines both elements of, major successful rock star and therapist,
right,
who genuinely understands, who's not only talked the talk, but he has walked the walk. He has been through that journey.
Right.
And, as we've just learned, he's been through it. Some of the most interesting aspects I thought were, dealing with success. This is something that it is counterintuitive. People don't often understand that, they think with great success comes, all your dreams are fulfilled and it just all works out and you're happy. A lot of times people don't know how to deal with success. They don't know how to deal with that. And this is something that I think does, because the more successful you are, especially in our business, especially today, the more that is demanded of you.
Right.
And that's what a lot of people don't get. And I think it's also the part that Ryan spoke about was understanding the internal conflicts that accompany external success. Very important, I think, for musicians to understand and to prepare for the psychological demands of fame. Most people do not have that. And we have seen along the way what happens when people are not prepared for that.
And he was a young man, so you got to think these guys are all young, early 20s, and they're dealing with all of this success. People, I guess, internalize that and they release it in different ways. And so I think that that's also another thing. And, like we talked about earlier at the top of the show, the whole idea that during his era and his time, this wasn't top of mind. Mental health wasn't like it is today now, where it's almost like become, and I don't want to diminish it at all, but like a catchphrase, because now it's everywhere. And thank God, because of all the different stories from different people that are finally coming out and talking about their journey, because before this was like a bad stigma, like they think you were crazy. And I'm sure during, Ryan's era, it was probably perceived as such. And so I thought that was, that's something that needs to be addressed too, that he was very young at that time, and a lot of things that were going on that are not currently like that we have now today. But one of the things that I thought were interesting was addressing personal challenges challenges head on with maintaining mental health and prioritizing self-care, non-negotiables in such demanding careers. He talked about towards the end of the interview, and I think I brought it up, like, why now don't we have people that might not be traveling with the artist, but maybe have like little tune-ups where they can go and talk to somebody, because the rigors of the road are super demanding. And that's a whole other conversation that we can have, and how that can take a mental toll just on sleep deprivation and all the other things, the excesses of the road lifestyle. And so I think it's an interesting thing that he talked about, where we're coming to a time where artists, maybe before they even go out on the road, having a thing where if you're in a group situation, in a band situation, where you have conversations prior to getting on the road, during, and even after. We referenced the Metallica documentary, Some Kind of Monster, where it kind of really gets into that with the whole idea of a therapist with a band, and how important that I think is today for bands to continue to be successful.
Yeah, and if I recall, that was back in what, 2000?
Early 2000s, I think 2003 or something like that.
And you saw, I mean, James ended up in a rehab for 9 months.
And that was still an era where that wasn't top of mind or that wasn't commonplace like it is today. So you know, it's an interesting character study in that world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, the point you're making is so important because it's essentially about self-care essentials. And it's the idea of setting up some kind of structure. And, you know, we're seeing a lot more people talk about that, whether it's Demi Lovato or whether it's Chappell Roan, who are pushing back. You know, when you have success, it's like, no, you're not doing 2 interviews today. You're doing 22.
Right.
You know, no, we're not going to do 4 shows next week. We're going to do 6.
Right.
And there is that demand that the more successful you become, the more demand there is on your time.
Exactly.
This is what people often don't get. You don't get to build success on your timetable.
Right.
Often, you know, and
you
this
have
is
to strike
where,
while the iron is hot.
Exactly. And that's the consciousness.
Right.
At any cost.
Right.
You strike while it's hot at any cost. And you just, you know, like what you were talking about in that era when they came up, you just suck it up.
Right.
Well, we've seen the casualties of that along the way. And that's what I think is so important today, is how people are talking about that and saying, no, I need to take care of me. And it's interesting when I think back of, you know, people over the years, whether it was James Hetfield, you know, saying, you know, I am going to take 9 months off. And you can imagine what that cost the band at that time. I mean, they were, you know, the enormity of just like, no, I'm not working, recording, or touring for 9 months.
Right.
Because if I do, I'll be dead.
Right. Exactly.
And, you know, and the pressures of that and how, you know, you realize when you are at that level, I mean, you know, or a Taylor Swift level or a Metallica level, how you are employing,
right,
you know, this
hundreds
whole,
of people. It's a whole apparatus. It's
yes.
It's a whole, you know, infrastructure.
Exactly. And you're keeping them, and there's like, you know,
there's the pressures of like, we're supporting these people. We, you know, yeah.
You can't be sick. You can't,
right.
Get your act together.
Exactly.
Suck it up. And, you know, how that just doesn't work anymore. And I think that's important.
And we had that recent casualty with the boy band. Was it One Direction? The gentleman that passed away. That was a you know, so we talk about
Liam down in South America and the drugs and my God.
And that was, and you know, he spoke, there was I think a documentary that came out, him talking about the struggles and the mental health of that, having that worldwide fame at such a young age and just how that impacts. And again, it's all how you internalize it, and everybody's different in their own way. And so I see a lot of people criticizing artists and saying, well, you know, you've got everything. Why would you be, you know, it's like, well, you don't realize it's an incredibly demanding job like any other job, but you've got everybody looking at you. You're like under a microscope. So it's a tremendous amount of pressure that people just do not realize until, you know, especially when you're having success like Orion, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 20 million albums, world tours, Grammys. When are you coming with the next one? Right. You know, I mean, it's not cliched, but there's a hard reality to what we're talking about. And again, this was an illustration of that, but more importantly, this was an illustration of someone's journey out of the darkness and into the light. And that, I thought, was what was making this so inspirational. And we hope that, you know, you guys got as much out of it as we did, because it was one of our most inspirational conversations about somebody that actually went through it and came out the other side.
Hey, Insiders, thanks so much for tuning into this episode. We really appreciate it. To get show notes, links, and everything that was mentioned during this interview, head on over to our official website at MUBUTV.com/podcast/show notes. If you're enjoying the content and what we're doing here on the show, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts from. And don't forget to rate and review our show at iTunes. 5-star reviews are always welcome and help to ensure that our podcast stands out on the top-rated and new and noteworthy charts on iTunes and our space. You can also find us at social media at Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter X, all ending with the handle MUBUTV, which is spelled MUBUTV. Don't forget to catch our flagship show, the MUBUTV Music Business Insider video series, airing every week on YouTube at youtube.com/MUBUTV. This show was produced and created by Rich Ezra and Eric Knight. Theme music by Disciples of Babylon, and be sure to tune in next week for another episode of the MUBUTV Music Business Insider Podcast.